This session is hosted by the Papa John Center for Entrepreneurship at Iowa State, and this year's Start Something series is really exciting because we are featuring the great professors we have here at Iowa State in the Ivy College of Business in our entrepreneurship programs. So today, Mike is going to share with us his area of research around health and well-being for entrepreneurs and use his research to help us apply that to ourselves as real-world entrepreneurs and what we do with that. So Mike, I'll go ahead and pass the mic over to you to share your content with us.
All right, thank you so much, Megan, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mike Lerman, and I'm an assistant professor of entrepreneurship here at Iowa State University. It is an honor to be here today to talk about entrepreneur health and well-being. Before I do, I just want to share kind of a few brief thoughts to help contextualize the information that I'll be sharing today. So first, my goal today is to talk at a very high level about some of the research that is on entrepreneur health and well-being and some of the underlying theories that inform that research. So my goal is not to be comprehensive, and in fact, I'm intentionally going to be a bit reductive in some of the concepts I'll discuss. So just bear in mind, there's a ton of important research being done in this area and important theoretical perspectives that we are not going to discuss today. Second, I will be referencing findings from existing research that either compares entrepreneurs to employees or entrepreneurs to other entrepreneurs. The difference between these groups and the individuals are only on average. So as a result, you might find that some of the findings I report here don't perfectly map onto your personal experience with entrepreneurship. And that is not only okay, but that is to be expected. Nothing I share today should be viewed as a prescription, but rather a data point that might help you in evaluating your own journey. And then finally, I'll just share that my primary goal is to start a conversation with all of you and to also help you start an internal conversation with yourself, to essentially allow you to begin evaluating how you might engage in entrepreneurial endeavors in a way that simultaneously benefits your business, but also your personal well-being. So I'm happy to engage with any of you immediately after this talk or in the future if you'd like to have a more in-depth discussion. That said, I want to start with a quote from one of the pioneers of academic research on entrepreneurial psychology, Robert Barron. In 2010, he said, "Why do entrepreneurs do it? Why do they put their financial well-being, careers, family, intimate relationships, and personal health at risk in what appears at best to be a perilous gamble and at worst, totally irrational behavior?" In fact, since the 1980s, researchers on entrepreneurship and health and well-being have tried to understand why entrepreneurs do what they do despite the apparent costs. On the surface, it doesn't really seem like entrepreneurship should benefit one's well-being. And if that is the case, why would entrepreneurs pursue business ownership? Answering that question first requires understanding what we mean when we say well-being. The most commonly studied type of well-being is hedonic well-being, which involves two different components. So first, we have the extent to which you are satisfied with the different components of your life. So we could think about satisfaction with your life as a whole, with your work, or with your family. The second component of hedonic well-being involves your emotional experiences. Experiencing more consistent and intense positive emotions, such as happiness and enthusiasm, and experiencing less consistent and less intense negative emotions, such as sadness and anxiousness, would suggest that you have higher hedonic well-being. However, scholars have also recognized that this view of well-being is potentially quite incomplete when it comes to understanding why entrepreneurs start and continue to run a business. In fact, even in that seminal work on entrepreneurs in the 80s suggested that entrepreneurs experience tons of demands that are often not conducive to general satisfaction and oftentimes produce a lot of negative emotions. So from a hedonic perspective, one could argue that entrepreneurship is not conducive to well-being. For example, consider Lily, the owner of Lily's Loaf, a micro bakery in London. She recently closed her bakery because, quote, the past few months have been incredibly stressful, and it's clear that the stress has taken a huge toll on my health and my body. She went on to say, quote, I have been burned out for a very long time, probably since last summer, if not before. The sources of stress that contributed to this included months of commercial lease negotiations, unexpected costs that resulted in financial strain, the wear and tear of just providing for customers with severe food allergies, even though serving those customers was her initial inspiration. And then, of course, as any baker could tell you, just the cost of waking up exceptionally early every morning in order to get those baked goods prepared for hungry customers. So on the surface, this sounds like a very sad story, but the reality is actually a bit deeper. So on her final day, all of her family, her friends, and her longtime customers showed up in droves, causing her to sell out in 45 minutes. She described this experience as follows. It was heartwarming and uplifting to see so many loyal customers who were there from the start. She goes on to share that while the bakery is closing, Lily's Loaf will continue to exist, because through this experience, she found a passion for developing a community on YouTube and Instagram around baking. She also has written an ebook on her experiences, and she has developed a business as a content creator for other bakeries. Too often, when it comes to entrepreneurship, we glorify performance, when in reality, we should probably be glorifying goal pursuit. Her business may not have performed, but her goal of spreading her love of baking to as many people as possible will be continued. And arguably, it'll even be enhanced as a result of the failure experience that she went through. Further, despite having some experiences that were perhaps not beneficial to her immediate hedonic well-being, there were also clearly some positive aspects to this experience, such as the realization of how many people support her, the identification of a passion that extends beyond the bakery, and the psychological resilience that she has developed simply from having gone through this experience. In other words, there's a deeper sense of psychological fulfillment that can occur as one encounters and overcomes entrepreneurial challenges. And what this might suggest is that a hedonic perspective on well-being does not tell the full story. This other type of well-being is referred to as eudaimonic well-being, or we might call it psychological fulfillment. Now, there are many different perspectives and definitions of psychological fulfillment. The one that I'm going to focus on today comes from a psychologist named Carol Riff, and her and other scholars have argued that entrepreneurship is ideal for facilitating this particular type of well-being. So I want to just briefly walk through what these 6 components of her conceptualization of eudaimonic well-being include. So first, we have autonomy. And by autonomy, I don't mean the typical definition of like whether or not you've been given autonomy, but rather the extent to which you act autonomously. In other words, do you allow the external environment to guide your actions, or are your actions based on the pursuit of your own goals? Second, environmental mastery, the extent to which you shape the surrounding environment to meet your personal needs and values. Third, personal growth, whether you are engaged in the continuous development of personal potential. Fourth, the development of warm and trusting relationships with others. Fifth, purpose in life, the extent to which you have meaning, direction, and goals in your life that unify your efforts towards overcoming challenges. And finally, self-acceptance, having positive attitudes towards yourself, but also being able to recognize your own limitations. I'm going to spend most of my time today discussing research on these 2 different types of well-being, but I want to note that there is also research on physical health outcomes like blood pressure or the experience of somatic symptoms. Likewise, there is research about the role of mental disorders in entrepreneurship, and in particular, Some mental disorders might actually be helpful for entrepreneurs in certain ways. And relatedly, being an entrepreneur might allow certain individuals to more effectively cope with some mental disorders relative to the experience of employees. Bringing all this together, we have discussed that when we say well-being, there are a couple different things that we could be referring to. So the question, does entrepreneurship facilitate well-being, is a multifaceted and complex question. To begin answering that question, I'm going to discuss 3 different perspectives that different areas of academic literature have taken, starting with a contextual perspective. This research usually is comparing entrepreneurship to traditional work settings and arguing that relative to the context that employees tend to work in, entrepreneurs experience work settings that facilitate greater well-being. For example, there is the job demands resources perspective, which argues that individuals need adequate resources in order to overcome their job demands, or else they'll experience stress. And so this framework is about balancing demands with the amount of resources that one has available to them. From this theory is the active job hypothesis, which suggests that entrepreneurs have actually a combination of both high demands and high resources. And put together, while we might expect that the demands entrepreneurs face can be very exhausting, because they have the resources to meet those demands, such as having a lot of work flexibility and autonomy within their work, we would also expect their demands to hold a lot of opportunity to be deeply fulfilling. Next, job characteristics theory argues that when individuals experience their work as meaningful, when they feel responsible for work outcomes, and when they receive direct feedback on their work, it can facilitate outcomes like motivation, performance, and well-being. Of course, entrepreneurs often do find their work meaningful because they tend to start their business with the intention of solving a particular problem that they personally care about. Likewise, responsibility is one of the most consistently reported experiences of entrepreneurs, especially once they begin hiring and managing employees whose paychecks are dependent on the performance of the business, or when they receive funds from an investor. And so now it isn't just their money at stake, but others as well. Finally, because entrepreneurship involves iteration and adaptation, getting feedback and incorporating it to improve the underlying business model is a fundamental feature of starting, developing, and growing a business. So for all of these reasons, we might expect entrepreneurship to facilitate greater well-being. Finally, job design theory broadly proposes that individuals are motivated to engage in what's called job crafting. And this entails making changes to one's working environment to find greater alignment between the job and one's own preferences. So theorists have argued that entrepreneurs have an uncanny ability to engage in job crafting. So that could include, for example, deciding the days and the times that you're going to work, deciding where you're going to work, deciding what problem you want to solve to begin with, choosing your target market, customizing the customer experience that you provide, deciding the roles that you want to fill for your business as opposed to the ones you want to hire people for. And of course, there are many other examples that I'm sure you could imagine. But the point is that as an entrepreneur, you have a unique opportunity to craft the ideal working environment for yourself, and this can facilitate greater well-being. Now, due to the nature of the webinar, we are not going to open the floor for Q&A until the end of the session, but just real briefly, if you are struggling with your well-being, there are a couple of things from a contextual perspective that you might consider. So first, you might think about the things you're already doing that maybe you didn't recognize as job crafting before, but now you can recognize, okay, these are some things I'm doing that are working well and allowing me to find alignment. Second, you might consider aspects of your work currently that are not very ideal. And then finally, you might think about the extent to which you have opportunities that exist in order to restructure your work to better align with your personal preferences. Moving beyond the contextual perspective, I now want to discuss the stressor-strain perspective. This literature is generally asking, what are the effects of stressors on entrepreneurs' health, well-being, and performance? And as you are aware, there are many different kinds of stressors that entrepreneurs experience, including general job demands, time urgency, workload, constraints, role ambiguity, interpersonal conflict, among many others. One prominent framework for understanding how these stressors might affect entrepreneurs and their ventures is the challenge hindrance stressor framework. This framework argues that all of these different stressors can actually be categorized into just two different types. The first is challenge stressors, such as general work demands and problem solving. And it is argued that these stressors are generally consistent with one's goals and thus generally promote positive outcomes, such as learning and achievement. And for that reason, they should facilitate better performance because they motivate individuals to engage effectively with those demands. However, it's important to note that engaging with these demands can still be psychologically costly, and so it can still lead to exhaustion and other detrimental effects on well-being. Conversely, the challenge hindrance stressor framework proposes that the other type of stressor, hindrance stressors, which include things like role conflict, interpersonal and work-family conflict, and role ambiguity, are both inconsistent with one's personal growth and tend to be inconsistent with one's goals, and thus should negatively impact motivation to engage with those demands and ultimately performance. Relatedly, because of their inconsistency with goals, this framework theorizes that hindrance stressors are particularly detrimental to one's well-being. This theory has been very heavily tested in employee contexts, with findings broadly supporting the predictions that I've described on outcomes like motivation, job satisfaction, turnover, performance, hedonic well-being, and physiological and psychological strain. Additionally, it's important to note that these general effects are influenced by organizational contexts and, of course, personal characteristics of the individuals that are facing those demands. In entrepreneurship, the effects of stressors on performance and well-being has been studied a lot less. But my colleagues and I did recently publish a quantitative review of 34 articles that are looking at these relationships. At a high level, what we found is that for entrepreneurs, challenge stressors did facilitate performance, but they had no effect on well-being, which is a good thing. Conversely, hindrance stressors were harmful for well-being, but had no effect on performance, which is also actually a good thing. So what's most important about these findings is that we were able to compare them to the literature on employees. And what we found is that relative to employees, entrepreneurs not only experience better positive outcomes resulting from these demands, but they also experience less harmful negative outcomes from these demands. Now, these differences could be attributable to a couple of different factors. So, for example, they might be related to the contextual perspective that we discussed earlier, or they could also be related to how entrepreneurs cope with the demands that they face. Now, there's a few things you might consider for yourself when reflecting on these results. First, it's valuable to have some general awareness that not all stressors are made equal. So some will be consistent with your goals and some will not. Some might be particularly harmful to your well-being. So as you identify what these different demands are, how often you tend to experience them, and how they usually affect you and your business, you can subsequently identify the most effective ways for overcoming them. And that is a topic that we're going to come back to in a few slides. One important future direction for this stream of literature is the need to understand eudaimonic well-being outcomes more. So that study that I just shared with you, where we collected all the existing research on the effects of stressors on well-being for entrepreneurs, that consisted almost entirely of hedonic well-being or physiological health outcomes. So in a follow-up study, some of my other colleagues and I wanted to study eudaimonic well-being. And in particular, we were looking at purpose in life. Further, instead of just comparing entrepreneurs to employees, we wanted to understand how these effects change across different types of entrepreneurship, such as social entrepreneurship relative to commercial entrepreneurship. What we found is that not only do social entrepreneurs experience greater purpose in life than commercial entrepreneurs, but they are also more resilient to hindrance stressors. So much so that hindrance stressors don't have any effect on the purpose in life of social entrepreneurs. So why do we expect this? Our theorizing for this result was very much rooted in the deeply embedded goal pursuit that social entrepreneurs often have. They care so deeply about benefiting humanity in some way that we argue they're able to remain resilient and continue goal pursuit even when they're faced with the most hindering demands. And further, they might even be energized by those hindering demands because they know that by overcoming those demands, they'll be able to achieve their underlying mission. That said, I would also speculate that commercial entrepreneurs can do several things that can develop this same type of resilience. One of the things they could do is related to a book written by Simon Sinek called Start With Why. The central argument of Start With Why is that when a business is driven by an underlying purpose, it will better provide true value to its customers, its employees, and its other stakeholders. So for example, we talked a little bit before about how failure does not necessarily mean the end of an entrepreneurial journey. So I would propose to you that the journey is likely to continue despite challenges when entrepreneurs have a clearly identifiable why that is driving their daily actions. So for example, it may be no surprise that when Lily, the founder of Lily's Loaf, transitioned into an online platform and digital marketing, she maintained her why, quote, sharing joyful, allergy-friendly recipes. However, this underlying why is also clearly demonstrated not just by entrepreneurs who fail, but even as they transition into different firms. So for example, Clayton Mooney headlines his LinkedIn with the following quote, "On a mission to provide people with the food they deserve." While this mission clearly aligns with his current firm, Clayton Farms, it also aligns perfectly with the mission of one of his prior ventures, Kinosol, which aimed to address food insecurity via a solar-powered food dehydrator. Finally, we can observe this why from Mike Shannon, one of the founders and the first CEO of PackBack. Under Mike's leadership, PackBack grew from an idea driven by a mission to spark curiosity to a service that has been used by over 2 million students, 3,000 college professors, and most major universities across the United States. Recently, Mike stepped down as CEO of PackBack, and he's begun developing a new firm, Improve. It is perhaps no surprise that even at this early stage of the firm's development, they already have a clear why, quote, making great coaching a habit. In summary, even as entrepreneurship does involve many sources of stress, things that keep you up at night, things that can cause conflict with other domains of life, things that could involve a tremendous sense of responsibility for the well-being of others or perhaps for the financial returns of your investors. You can take these demands head on and embrace them as an opportunity for growth. And one of the ways that can help you do that is by maintaining a clear vision that you are pursuing. So I would encourage you to reflect on what is your why. So far, we've discussed the contextual perspective and the stress or strain perspective. The last perspective that I want to discuss with you today is the coping perspective. This literature argues that it isn't the demands themselves that determine well-being, but rather how we respond to those demands psychologically and behaviorally. There are many different theoretical perspectives on coping, and there are literally hundreds of classifications of different coping behaviors. However, one of the most commonly used classifications of coping involves the simple distinction between problem-focused and emotion-focused coping. Problem-focused coping involves productive and proactive behaviors and thoughts that are oriented towards overcoming challenges. So for example, this might include planning or actively engaging with a stressor. Conversely, emotion-focused coping involves behaviors and thoughts that are aimed at making you feel better about a situation, but are not addressing the underlying problem. For example, these might include venting or denial. My colleagues and I recently published a paper in Entrepreneurship Theory and Practice where we combined the contextual perspective with the entrepreneurs and employees in terms of eudaimonic well-being. And this involved a multi-wave, nationally representative sample of individuals in their midlife in the United States. Using the contextual perspective, we argued and found that entrepreneurs use greater amounts of problem-focused coping and less amounts of emotion-focused coping relative to employees, which we argue is because entrepreneur work environments provide greater opportunity to engage in more effective coping behaviors. Then, using a coping perspective, we argued and found evidence that because entrepreneurs use greater amounts of problem-focused coping and less emotion-focused coping, they also tend to experience greater eudaimonic well-being than employees. Now, this is just one study, and it has many limitations and boundary conditions, but it does provide some evidence that the way we respond to the demands that we encounter plays a large role in determining our degree of psychological fulfillment. However, entrepreneurs also sometimes engage in unhealthy behaviors. And again, we often see that these unhealthy behaviors involve the intersection of the contextual and coping perspectives. So for example, in a recently published study, my colleagues and I identify that the self-employed are more likely to engage in what we call health-related resourcefulness behaviors, such as skipping medications in order to save money. And so we typically think about resourcefulness as a good thing, and entrepreneurs do often leverage resourcefulness to many positive outcomes in terms of their venture. But unfortunately, this can also extend into how they are managing their own personal health decisions. Contextually, why is this occurring? For the younger self-employed, it appears that this is occurring because of affordability concerns. And for the older self-employed individuals, this tends to occur because of accessibility concerns. But there is more research to be done in this area. As a couple kind of more, I guess, negative examples, I've been very fortunate to be an invited guest speaker to the Health and Entrepreneurship Research Forum for the last 2 years. And this is hosted by Matter Chicago, which is an incubator for healthcare startups, and DePaul University in their Coleman Center of Entrepreneurship. This forum invites thought leaders in the field of entrepreneurship, health, and well-being to present their research and build an academic community around this important topic. This forum is also attended by local entrepreneurs, angel investors, and venture capitalists. And on the last day, they sit in the front and the academics ask them questions about their experiences. So when we asked the investors how many of them considered the health and well-being of the entrepreneurs in their investment decisions, not only did none of them report doing so, but they also indicated that within their network of investors, when they are discussing whether or not they should consider making an investment, it is almost never the case that the health and well-being of the entrepreneur enters that conversation. That said, they did also indicate that there are some investor groups they are aware of that are beginning to prioritize this more. But the reality is that until it is more widely understood that a healthy entrepreneur will very likely outperform an unhealthy entrepreneur, it is important to recognize that not all stakeholders surrounding your business are going to prioritize your well-being as much as they might prioritize other factors such as financial returns. Relatedly, one of the entrepreneurs in the panel, he still owns a donut shop in Chicago. He bought this shop as an established business from the founders who were wanting to retire. Since he bought the firm, he has consistently worked 16 hours a day, 7 days a week, with the vast majority of his time just on the line making donuts. He reported almost never sleeping more than 4 hours a day since he's owned the business. Now, keep in mind, we had one of the leading experts in sleep and entrepreneurship in the audience, Dr. Jeffrey Gish, and Dr. Gish had delivered a very detailed and informative presentation on the importance of sleep and the ramifications of not getting adequate sleep, which that entrepreneur attended. Despite this, during the panel discussion, the entrepreneur said the following thing, which I'm paraphrasing, quote, "For me, getting more sleep is not an option. I have customers that expect to get my donuts every morning, and I am committed to having those donuts ready for them each day. I hear what you are saying about sleep and that I need to get more, but I would rather you explain to me how I can best maximize my 4 hours of sleep than to tell me that I simply need to sleep more." In other words, even when faced with the stark reality that his health is going to deteriorate if he does not adapt his sleeping patterns, he is unwilling to even consider the possibility of adapting his work environment to allow him a full night of sleep. So the takeaway here is that while entrepreneurship has potential from a contextual perspective to be very valuable for your health and well-being, it can also cause you a lot of harm if you allow the business to run you instead of you running the business. It is ultimately your responsibility as the entrepreneur to create a healthy work environment, to create work-life balance, and to prioritize your well-being, even as you are pursuing the development of your business. In light of this risk, Amanda Williamson and colleagues developed a valuable agenda for research on recovery from entrepreneurial demands. And in fact, there has been a developing stream of things entrepreneurs can do to facilitate their own well-being, including things like sleep, psychological detachment from work, meditation, and mentorship. However, drawing on the broader psychology literature, Williamson and colleagues propose that recovery involves the 3 R's: respite, reappraisal, and regimen. So respite involves things like taking breaks, spending time in nature, socializing, engaging in positive reflection, among others. The second R, reappraisal, involves shifting your mindset around the demands you face. And this is best done via cognitive behavioral therapy. So if you are a student here at ISU, you have access to counseling services. And I would highly recommend that you use these services proactively as opposed to reactively. However, you also want to surround yourself with entrepreneurs that have had similar experiences in the past. So for example, when I talk to entrepreneurs who have gone through severe challenges and have come out of that more resilient, they very often credit their mentors for helping them to reinterpret their challenges as opportunities for growth. Finally, in addition to entrepreneurs that have done it before, you want to surround yourself with entrepreneurs that are currently experiencing similar challenges as what you are, to kind of form a support group for each other. So as many of you know, we have a wonderful entrepreneurship incubator here at Iowa State, SciStarters, and there's a lot of great things about that program. So Megan Gradinger, she is an exceptional leader. And there are also exceptional contributions from a very talented JPEG team. The curriculum is additionally what I would consider a masterclass in entrepreneurship, especially at the early stages of business development. However, what is not often discussed about SciStarters, but which I believe is as valuable as its other components, is that SciStarters builds a community of entrepreneurs that support each other as they encounter the various sources of stress that can inevitably wear you down if you don't have people in your corner. The third R, regimen, involves the combination of sleep, exercise, nutrition, and hydration. So taking a step back and reflecting on this coping perspective broadly, what I would encourage you to do is to holistically assess the coping and recovery practices that you are currently utilizing, identifying adaptations that might be valuable, And critically, keeping a regular journal on how different behaviors that you are engaging in are translating to different well-being outcomes each day. There's no scenario where you're going to be perfect in your day-to-day behaviors and always do all the things that maximize your well-being. However, with intentional direction, you can develop a daily life where your behaviors facilitate a thriving business while also facilitating your own health and well-being. So just as we opened with a quote, I want to close on a quote from Theodore Roosevelt. Far and away, the best prize that life offers is the chance to work hard at work worth doing. And with that said, I want to thank you so much for your time today. I'll open the floor to questions.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Mike. That was great. So now, if anybody has questions, if you could drop them in the chat and we will ask them right now. I can kind of start while we're waiting for questions to come in. So Mike, I know you shared some tangible things there at the end, but if you had to distill it down to like 3 things that you would tell somebody who's either been in entrepreneurship or is new to entrepreneurship that they should do to have that fulfillment and to have well-being, what would you say? Like 3 to 5 really tangible things that somebody should be thinking about.
Sure, yeah. So I mean, I would say I'm going to try not to cheat. I'm going to try to stick to 3. So first thing is mentorship. I don't think I've really spoken to a single entrepreneur actually that really was finding great fulfillment in their work that didn't have a network of other entrepreneurs and other people that could support them. So that's very critical because one of the greatest risks of being a business owner is loneliness. So absolutely the mentorship and social support component. Second, I would say kind of that cocktail of things that just generally facilitate one's health and well-being, so like sleep, nutrition, exercise, right? I think that it's fair to count that as one. And the third would absolutely be the daily journaling. So I've done several studies where, and they're unpublished as of now, so that's why I don't talk about them within this presentation, but I've done several experience sampling studies where we have entrepreneurs essentially journaling every day. They're filling out surveys in the morning and the evening about their different work experiences. And we're looking at, well, how does that translate to well-being outcomes? But while this isn't really part of the study, several of the entrepreneurs, each time I've done this kind of study, reach out to me and they say, I didn't realize this, but on days that I do this, it tends to lead to this outcome. And a couple entrepreneurs have reached out and said, yeah, I actually always engage in daily journaling. And it's kind of allowed me to figure out things I would have never realized that are actually contributing to positive or negative outcomes. And so I think daily journaling has so much value to you because it'll just help with general awareness of things that you might not even be aware that are going on.
Awesome. We have a couple of questions in chat, but I want to expand on that first really quickly. So when they journal, are there certain prompts or things that you would encourage them to think about?
That's a great question. Yeah, so I think, so in the morning, right, if you were going to journal, and any journaling is good. So if you're only going to journal, in the evening, that would be fine. But I think some of the value of journaling in the morning is that you can reflect on, okay, what are the challenging things that I'm expecting to encounter today? Or what are like the big things that I know I'm going to need to address? And this is an opportunity to kind of evaluate how you're emotionally responding to these things, which can kind of inform maybe how you might behaviorally engage with those situations. It's also an opportunity to kind of take a step back and reflect on things that you're just very grateful for, right? Reflect on how the kind of positive aspects of your life, which in turn might allow you to interpret those impending demands more positively. Now, in the evening, you do want to still engage in some journaling about how you're currently feeling, but you also want to now be kind of reflecting on how the day went. What are the things that you actually did, particularly as it relates to those major demands that you encountered that day? What are the areas that you think you could have been better at? What are the things that you did really well, right? And then you can kind of consider, okay, to what extent did things that I was kind of thinking about in the morning affect the way my day ended up going? And how did the way my day unfolded affect the way I'm feeling now? So you're kind of drawing these causal relationships, so to speak. And if you do that over time, right, you can begin to recognize patterns, right? And you can begin to test out different things. Okay, so what happens if today in the morning I go for a walk and I get out in the sun a little bit, right? How does that affect the way the rest of my day goes, right? Or if I sleep 8 hours instead of 4 hours, how will that affect the way that my day goes? And while there is always going to be research that can tell you, yeah, you got to get more sleep, or you should do this, or you should do that, you shouldn't do this. As I noted at the beginning, sometimes there's a lot of variation for each individual in terms of like what are the things that are best for them. So, for example, some of my colleagues here at Iowa State swear by biking everywhere you go, and like that, like really contributes to their well-being. But personally, I hate biking, and so I would never want to incorporate that into my own practices. So it's kind of about finding what works best for you.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think that's really helpful. I think it's easy, especially in entrepreneurship, because you are so busy to like ignore some of those steps of noticing what's working and not. So I think that's great advice. Kiera asked, what advice would you give students balancing school as well as entrepreneurship, being that our schedules are inconsistent at times?
Yeah, and I really sympathize with that. I think trying to be an entrepreneur while a student is incredibly challenging, and it's worth noting that in addition to the business and school, a lot of students are also working as well, right? So you have a lot of multifaceted demands, and that's not even including the extracurricular activities you're doing. So I think first and foremost, it's about simply recognizing that you are in an unusually challenging time in life where you just have a lot of competing demands. And so I think it's important to kind of recognize that and just understand that if you're falling behind on things, you're not a failure, right? There's nothing wrong with you. It's just that you're in this really challenging situation. So that's one thing you can do. Another thing I would do is honestly, I would build very strong relationships with your professors and make sure they understand the things that you're going through and the things that you're experiencing. In my case, I know that many of my students can attest to the fact that I do as much as possible to help accommodate students within their goals. And that's not only as entrepreneurs, but for example, students that need to go to career fair events, right? I'm always working with them to ensure they can do those things. They're prioritizing their long-term goals and not just their short-term goals. For students in my class who are entrepreneurs, that means that I'm heavily encouraging them not only to bring aspects of their business into the classroom where we're kind of talking about things that are going on with their business in the class to the extent they're willing to share, but I'm also encouraging them to leverage their business pursuit within their project for the class. And so they're finding some synergy between the demands of the class and the demands of their business. But again, I would just want to kind of close by saying that there's no silver bullet for the issue you raised. Like, I really think it is just a challenging time. And so I guess the last thing I would say is it's kind of paradoxical, but it's often the case that people that are the most busy are actually the ones that most need to take a break. And so what I would encourage you to do is, as busy as you are, set boundaries where you are going to force yourself to engage in something that you are really passionate about that is not work related.
Awesome. Thanks, Mike. Rita asked 2 questions. One, what other options did Lily weigh, if you know them? And 2, what is the connection of health to successful examples of entrepreneurs? And then in parentheses shared, only 10% of startups succeed.
Sorry, let's start
Yep,
the first one, and then if you could repeat the second one when we get there, that'd be great.
Yes.
Yeah. So I would definitely recommend you go look at the Lily's Loaf YouTube channel, because you can watch. She does a full video of kind of that her whole experience going through that last day, and it is really fascinating. She wasn't in business. She wasn't within that particular location for a very long time. My understanding is she was only there for about 6 months before she moved on. And one of the prominent issues was that she had negotiated a lease that had some aspects to it that she didn't realize. But then one of the other prominent aspects, and I didn't include pictures because it's pretty graphic actually, but the stress that she was experiencing led to some bodily reaction, like things on her skin that was a condition she had dealt with in like earlier in her life, but it like really flared up and became a huge problem for her. And so even just physically, the stress of running the business was weighing a toll on her. As far as I can tell, I guess I'm not really sure what you mean by like what other things she considered in the sense that she did transition out of that into other businesses, right? So she did consider, okay, the physical location, like actually baking things here, that's not working, right? But because I've done this, now I've identified a community of people that I can engage with via social media, via writing books, right? And she also identified that because she did engage in that social support network and she developed relationships with other bakeries, she's now able to provide content for them, social media content. And so in these ways, I think she's found an avenue towards continuing her passion. If there's perhaps something else you're looking for, I'm happy to try to address it, but.
Awesome. We'll wait to see if she adds
Okay.
anything else to the chat.
Yeah,
But
sorry, what was, yeah.
the second question was, what is the connection of health to successful examples of entrepreneurs? She mentions only 10% of the stat of like 10-20% of entrepreneurs succeed. So I think she's curious about, is there a connection between health and the successful entrepreneurs? Have you seen any parallels there? Like if they've taken care of themselves, it makes them more successful or anything like that?
I think that's a really good question. I don't have a very straightforward answer in the sense that obviously there's a lot of range to entrepreneurship. So when you say highly successful, I'm thinking about, people that have developed unicorn businesses, right? And most of the research done on the space is actually more on your typical entrepreneurs that have more like small to medium sized ventures, but not necessarily what we would define as like highly successful. Although I think there is more research that is being developed in that space. What I can say just anecdotally is highly successful entrepreneurs that tend to kind of speak out in the media do tend to talk about some of these practices that I've outlined here. But I think what is potentially problematic about that is they're kind of talking after the fact about what they did. So you don't necessarily know if that's really what their life was like. And I've heard a lot of cases of entrepreneurs who were highly successful, as in multiple $100 million exits, who they start realizing how important health and well-being is after they had that success. And so they weren't necessarily taking care of their health and well-being during that time. So I know it's maybe not an exciting answer. I wish I had something more definitive that I could tell you, but I think the reality is that we need more research on what the experience looks like for entrepreneurs when they're actually in that process of building a highly successful business, to document kind of how those health and well-being practices are unfolding and whether or not they are the contributing factor to them succeeding, or whether they're something that is perhaps just kind of a component that might help, but it's not like the reason that they succeeded.
Justin asked, what are your entrepreneurial experiences? What struggles did you have with mental health and well-being? Then he asked another question that's kind of aligned but different. So maybe we can start there. Do you want to share a little bit about your experiences, Mike?
Yeah, so I mean, I've had several failure entrepreneurial experiences, which included working with my own brother on an early stage business. And, as you can imagine, some of the interpersonal conflicts that can unfold there are even more salient when it's also, a sibling or someone that you're very close with, that you're working with. But most of my entrepreneurial experiences involve, interacting with a wide range of entrepreneurs, right? So this includes not only a lot of the quantitative data collections that I've described, but also qualitative experiences. So for example, that included working with entrepreneurs in Oaxaca, Mexico that are building ventures in a base of the pyramid context, right? So you have very limited access to resources, and yet many of these entrepreneurs are building thriving businesses, not only within their local community, but in some cases also international. And then also that involved an ethnographic approach where I actually worked within an entrepreneurial venture of a 12-person founding team developing baby consumer goods. And I think the value about this approach is I kind of got to see live to what extent they were engaging in these practices, but also kind of how teams work together or sometimes don't work very well together, and how that can contribute to health and well-being outcomes.
The second half of Justin's question
What?
is,
Yeah.
can
Go ahead.
you talk more about managing financial stress, especially starting out and trying to get funding and clients?
Yeah, I mean, so I think managing financial stress is going to be salient in a couple different ways. So for one, if you're a business that's kind of going more of a bootstrapping route and you're not trying to raise any funds, the way I've had entrepreneurs describe this to me is that you're essentially living on bread and water. And so I think the stress there is that you just have very limited resources, and yet you're trying to figure out some big business problems that oftentimes require financial resources. And so that's a tension that is there. And I think that, at least what I've experienced, is that the best way to cope with that is by having those other people in the business that are going through the same thing, that understand what you're going through and can help see you through that. And again, having mentors that have also gone through similar experiences that can help you kind of see the light at the end of the tunnel. To speak, I guess, a bit more on that, it's important to recognize, kind of as we talked about before, that performance is not necessarily all that matters, right? There's other components of entrepreneurship that are meaningful. And I think when we're in a situation where we don't have a lot of money, we might feel like, okay, I'm not succeeding, I'm not successful, I'm not performing. But the reality is that you're just at a different stage, right? So it's important to keep that long-term vision in mind, understand where you're headed, and understand that, yeah, right now there are some sacrifices you're making, but you're building towards something that's deeply meaningful to you. There was something else you said, trying to get funding and clients. So there is of course, another route, right, to business where you're going to go and you're going to try to get financial investors. And I have done much less research on entrepreneurs that have gone this route, but I do have more informal contacts within that space. And I have talked to them about this experience a little bit. And the main thing to me is that it seems that once you take money from other people, your sense of responsibility for that money can be very overburdening. I don't have any tangible advice for how to deal with that burden because it's very far from my personal experience. And like I said, I haven't done a ton of research in that area. That said, if that is a particular type of venture that you are pursuing, I would be happy to connect you with a couple people I know that have experienced that and who I'm sure would be willing to share their experiences.
Awesome, thanks. Another question we got is, in the midst of the current AI revolution, do you see AI playing a role in increasing hindrance stressors, for example? And how do you think AI could hinder or support entrepreneurs' psychological well-being?
Hey, Ali, it's good to see you. Thank you for joining us. It's a really good question. And actually, one of my co-authors is constantly calling me to do a study on AI. It's not an area that I've delved too deeply into yet. But overall, what I would speculate is that it has very much to do with how the entrepreneur conceptualizes AI. So if you view it as just this threat that you kind of just take it as kind of a negative thing, so you don't ever bother to engage with it or think about how it might benefit your business, then I think what will happen is, unfortunately, is that your competition is going to use it to their benefit. And it probably will produce some different hindrance stressors for you, mostly because you'll likely fall behind relative to your competitors. On the other hand, if you recognize AI for what it is, which is just a tool, just like all the other tools that you're using, and you just think about what are some ways I can use this tool that can enhance what I'm doing, then I think you're likely to find that it's very consistent with your goals as opposed to something that is going to be hindering to you.
All right, that's the last of the questions in the chat we've gotten so far. If you have any other questions, we've got a few more minutes, so feel free to drop them in the chat. I want to say thanks again, Mike. That was really great. I think my favorite takeaway was this idea of goal pursuit over performance. I think it's really easy to get stuck in that trap, and I'd never thought about that before. So that's my main takeaway. I appreciate that. While I have some of your attention, I also want to share a couple upcoming opportunities for everybody to participate in. We're doing a couple of free in-person events in the next couple weeks around similar topics in entrepreneurship and how to be successful. So on Tuesday, March 26th, we have an alumni of Iowa State and gentleman called Cactus Jack, who was on Shark Tank, who's going to share about his experience and how to be successful. That'll be on campus at Iowa State from 4 to 6 p.m. It's open to the public and anybody's welcome to join us. So you can check out the events page on our website to register. And then the following week on Tuesday, April 2nd, we're doing a lunch, a free lunch where we have a speaker coming in who will share about their experiences in entrepreneurship as well. So again, both of those are free for anybody to attend, and you can find them on our events page of our website. It looks like we have gotten no more questions, just a lot of thanks. So again, Mike, this was super informative. Really appreciate you taking the time to share all of your great research and findings with us, and just appreciate it. Thanks so much.
Absolutely. It was a pleasure. And again, if anyone would like to reach out to me personally, I'd be happy to talk more.
Awesome. Thank you, Mike. It looks like he dropped his email in the chat for anybody who wants to connect with him. We'll get this recording on YouTube sometime this afternoon and send it out to all of you. Thanks for spending your lunch hour with us. Have a good day. Recorded to go on YouTube, and we will share that later today on YouTube for you to go back and watch or to share with other friends and entrepreneurs who might find today's content helpful.
Have a great day.